7 days. That's all it took for Vanessa Chen to go from being escorted out of Sterling Financial Group's headquarters with her belongings in a cardboard box to walking back through those same glass doors as the company's new chief executive officer. What happened in that boardroom on a rainy Tuesday morning in Chicago wasn't just career suicide, it was the most expensive truth anyone had ever spoken at Sterling Financial. And it all started with a presentation that was supposed to be routine. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Vanessa had always been the kind of person who said what others were thinking, but were too afraid to voice. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, as the daughter of immigrants who built their small restaurant from nothing, she learned early that sugarcoating problems didn't make them disappear. Her parents, David and Linda Chen, had taught her that honesty wasn't just a moral choice, it was a survival skill. When health inspectors came around, when suppliers tried to overcharge, when employees weren't pulling their weight, the Chens faced reality head-on. This approach had kept their family business thriving for over 2 decades. That same unflinching honesty had propelled Vanessa through her MBA at Northwestern and into the competitive world of corporate finance. At 28, she was already a senior vice president at Sterling Financial Group, one of Chicago's most prestigious investment firms. Her colleagues respected her analytical mind, her ability to spot problems others missed, and her track record of turning around troubled accounts. What they didn't always appreciate was her tendency to cut through corporate speak and get straight to the point. Sterling Financial Group occupied 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in Chicago's Loop District. The company had been founded in 1987 by Marcus Sterling, a charismatic financier who built his empire on aggressive growth strategies and an even more aggressive company culture. By 2024, Sterling Financial managed over $12 billion in assets and employed nearly 800 people across 4 offices. The company prided itself on being bold, innovative, and results-driven, at least according to the motivational posters scattered throughout their offices. The reality was more complicated. Under Marcus Sterling's leadership, the company had developed a culture where questioning senior management was career suicide, where bad news was buried rather than addressed, and where appearance mattered more than substance. Executives drove luxury cars, wore expensive suits, and spoke in buzzwords that meant nothing but sounded impressive in client meetings. The company's recent public relations campaigns featured glossy photos of their leadership team looking confident and successful, but behind the scenes, several major problems were festering. Vanessa had joined Sterling Financial 3 years earlier, recruited directly from Goldman Sachs, where she had built a reputation as a rising star in corporate restructuring. Her hiring had been a coup for Sterling. Landing someone with her credentials and track record was exactly the kind of move that impressed investors and clients. Marcus Sterling himself had personally courted her, promising autonomy, resources, and the opportunity to lead high-profile deals. The honeymoon period had lasted about 6 months. That's when Vanessa began to notice the disconnect between Sterling Financial's public image and its internal operations. Client portfolios that should have been performing were stagnating. Risk management protocols that looked good on paper were being ignored in practice. Senior executives were making decisions based on politics rather than data, and anyone who questioned these decisions found themselves marginalized or pushed out entirely. Despite these concerns, Vanessa had found ways to excel within the system. She focused on her own accounts, delivered consistent results, and built strong relationships with clients who valued her straightforward approach. Her portfolio had grown by 37% over the past year, well above the company average. She had successfully restructured deals that other VPs had written off as lost causes, and her client retention rate was among the highest in the firm. But Vanessa's success came with a price. The more she achieved, the more visible she became within the company, and the more pressure she felt to conform to Sterling Financial's culture. She watched as colleagues who raised legitimate concerns were transferred to less desirable positions or found their bonuses mysteriously reduced. She saw talented analysts leave for competitors rather than deal with the toxic environment that had developed in several departments. The situation came to a head in early November 2024, when Sterling Financial's board announced they would be conducting a comprehensive review of all major business units. This review, led by Chief Operating Officer William Patterson, was ostensibly designed to identify opportunities for growth and efficiency improvements. In reality, everyone knew it was Marcus Sterling's way of consolidating power and eliminating anyone he viewed as a threat to his authority. Each department head was required to present a detailed analysis of their unit's performance, along with recommendations for the coming fiscal year. These presentations would be delivered to the full executive committee, including Marcus Sterling, COO William Patterson, Chief Financial Officer Rebecca Walsh, and Head of Human Resources Jennifer Morrison. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Careers would be made or broken based on these presentations. Vanessa spent 3 weeks preparing her presentation for the corporate restructuring division. She analyzed every deal, every client relationship, every process and procedure within her department. What she found was both encouraging and deeply troubling. Her team was performing exceptionally well, despite operating within a system that seemed designed to handicap their success. They were consistently hitting their targets while other divisions struggled, but they were doing so by working around company policies rather than because of them. The data told a clear story. Sterling Financial's corporate culture was actively harming business performance. Client satisfaction scores were declining across multiple divisions. Employee turnover in key departments was running at nearly 40% annually, far above industry averages. The company was losing talented people to competitors who offered better work environments, even when Sterling matched or exceeded their salary offers. Most troubling of all, Vanessa discovered that several of the company's recent high-profile successes were built on unsustainable practices. Aggressive accounting methods were being used to inflate short-term profits at the expense of long-term stability. Client relationships were being burned through high-pressure sales tactics that prioritized immediate revenue over ongoing partnerships. The company's impressive growth numbers looked good to investors, but they masked underlying weaknesses that could prove catastrophic if economic conditions shifted. As Vanessa compiled her findings, she faced a choice that would define her career. She could deliver a safe presentation that highlighted her department's successes while glossing over the systemic problems she had identified. This approach would protect her position and probably earn her praise from senior management. Alternatively, she could present the full truth about what she had discovered, knowing that doing so would likely make her a target for retaliation. The decision became even more complicated when Vanessa learned that several other department heads had already delivered their presentations to the executive committee. According to office gossip, these presentations had followed a predictable pattern: glowing reports about current performance, ambitious projections for future growth, and carefully worded requests for additional resources. No one had raised any concerns about company culture or long-term sustainability. No one had questioned whether Sterling Financial's current trajectory was actually sustainable. 3 days before her scheduled presentation, Vanessa had a conversation that crystallized her thinking. She was having lunch with Dr. Sarah Kim, a former colleague from Goldman Sachs, who now worked as an independent consultant specializing in organizational development. Sarah had been following Sterling Financial's public reports and was curious about Vanessa's experience working there. "You know what's interesting about Sterling Financial?" Sarah said as they sat in a quiet corner of a downtown restaurant. "Their numbers look great on paper, but every headhunter in the city is telling me they can't keep good people. That's usually a sign of deeper problems." Vanessa nodded but remained non-committal. She had learned to be careful about discussing internal company matters, even with trusted friends. But Sarah's observation hit home because it aligned perfectly with what Vanessa had been seeing firsthand. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "companies can mask cultural problems for a while, especially in a strong economy. But when things get tough, and they always do eventually, those chickens come home to roost. The firms that survive and thrive long-term are the ones that build sustainable practices and retain top talent. The ones that prioritize appearance over substance usually don't fare as well." That conversation stayed with Vanessa over the following days. She found herself thinking about her parents' restaurant and how they had built something lasting by facing problems honestly rather than hiding from them. She thought about the talented colleagues who had left Sterling Financial for better opportunities and about the clients who had expressed subtle concerns about the company's approach to their accounts. By the time Vanessa sat down to finalize her presentation, she had made her decision. She would tell the truth, not just about her department's performance, but about the broader challenges facing Sterling Financial. She would present her findings professionally and constructively, focusing on solutions rather than just problems, but she would not sugarcoat reality or pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. The presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m. on Tuesday, November 19th in Sterling Financial's main conference room on the 42nd floor. The room itself was designed to intimidate, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of Lake Michigan, A massive mahogany conference table that could seat 20 people, and walls lined with awards and photos commemorating the company's various achievements. This was where deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars were negotiated, where careers were made and destroyed, where the future direction of Sterling Financial was decided. As Vanessa arrived at the office that Tuesday morning, she felt a familiar mix of nerves and determination. She had triple-checked her data, rehearsed her key points, and prepared for likely questions and objections. Her presentation materials were organized, her slides were polished, and her recommendations were backed by solid analysis. She was as ready as she could possibly be. What Vanessa couldn't have anticipated was that this meeting would become the most consequential hour of her professional life, not just for her own career, but for the future of Sterling Financial Group itself. In 60 minutes, she would go from being a respected senior executive to a persona non grata escorted from the building by security. But she would also set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately vindicate every word she was about to speak. The stage was set. The players were in position. And Vanessa Chen was about to deliver the most expensive truth in Sterling Financial's 37-year history. At 9:45 a.m., Vanessa made her way to the 42nd floor conference room, her laptop bag containing what would soon become the most controversial presentation in Sterling Financial's history. The executive assistants were bustling around, ensuring everything was perfect for the leadership team's arrival. Fresh coffee, imported Danish pastries, leather portfolios positioned precisely at each seat, all the trappings of corporate theater. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Marcus Sterling entered first, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. At 53, he still carried himself with the swagger of a man who had never been told no, never faced real consequences for his decisions. Behind him came William Patterson, the COO, whose political maneuvering had made him Sterling's right-hand man despite a track record that was more style than substance. Rebecca Walsh, the CFO, took her usual seat near the head of the table. She was brilliant with numbers but had learned long ago that questioning Sterling's vision was a career-limiting move. Jennifer Morrison from HR rounded out the group, her primary job being to manage the fallout from Sterling's increasingly toxic leadership style while maintaining the company's polished external image. "Vanessa, good to see you," Sterling said with the kind of practiced charm that had served him well in client meetings and board presentations. "I've been looking forward to hearing about the great work your team has been doing. Your numbers have been impressive." The meeting began with the usual pleasantries. Sterling talked about the company's strong third quarter, the successful launch of their new investment product line, and the positive coverage they had received in financial publications. Patterson chimed in with updates on operational efficiency metrics that sounded good but meant very little in practical terms. Then it was time for Vanessa's presentation. She connected her laptop to the room's massive display screen and pulled up her first slide. Instead of the typical corporate template filled with buzzwords and colorful graphics, her presentation was stark and data-focused. The title read, "Corporate Restructuring Division, Performance Analysis and Strategic Recommendations." "Thank you for the opportunity to present today," Vanessa began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I want to start by acknowledging that my team has achieved strong results this year. We've exceeded our revenue targets by 18%, maintained a client retention rate of 94%, and successfully completed restructuring projects worth over $800 million. Nods around the table. This was exactly what they wanted to hear. However, Vanessa continued, advancing to her next slide, "Achieving these results required us to work around significant systemic challenges that are impacting not just my division, but the entire company. Today I want to share what I've discovered and propose solutions that could dramatically improve our performance across all business units." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sterling's smile became more forced. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Vanessa's next slide displayed employee turnover statistics across Sterling Financial's various departments. The numbers were damning. Some divisions were losing nearly half their staff annually, with exit interview data revealing consistent themes around poor management, lack of career development, and a toxic work environment. "These turnover rates are costing us approximately $12 million annually in recruiting, training, and lost productivity," Vanessa explained, her voice calm and professional. "More importantly, We're losing institutional knowledge and damaging client relationships when experienced team members leave. Now wait just a minute, Patterson interjected, his face reddening. Those numbers are taken out of context. Every financial services firm deals with competitive hiring pressures. You're absolutely right about competitive pressures, Vanessa replied smoothly. Which is why I benchmarked our turnover rates against industry standards. Her next slide showed Sterling Financial's numbers compared to their top 5 competitors. Sterling's rates were significantly higher across every category. Jennifer Morrison cleared her throat. Vanessa, while this data is interesting, I'm not sure this is the appropriate forum for discussing HR metrics. Perhaps we should schedule a separate meeting. Actually, this directly relates to our business performance, Vanessa said, advancing to her next slide. Because high-performing employees don't just leave randomly, they leave for specific addressable reasons. What followed was 20 minutes of the most uncomfortable truth-telling Sterling Financial's leadership had ever experienced. Vanessa systematically dismantled the company's carefully constructed narrative of success, using hard data to expose the rot beneath the surface. She showed how Sterling's aggressive sales tactics were burning through client relationships. While the company celebrated record revenue numbers, client satisfaction scores had dropped by 23% over the past 18 months. Several major clients had privately expressed concerns about Sterling's approach, with 2 Fortune 500 companies actively reviewing their relationships. The Montgomery Industries account is a perfect example, Vanessa said, pulling up specific case studies. We pushed them into a restructuring deal that generated $2 million in fees for us, but it wasn't actually in their best interest. Their CFO told me confidentially that they felt pressured into the agreement and are now working with Brookstone Capital for their ongoing needs. Sterling's jaw tightened. Montgomery Industries had been one of his personal success stories featured prominently in the company's marketing materials. Vanessa continued her methodical destruction of Sterling's corporate mythology. She revealed how the company's impressive growth numbers were partly built on unsustainable practices. Deals were being structured to maximize short-term revenue at the expense of long-term client value. Risk management protocols were being bypassed when they interfered with aggressive sales goals. The company's celebrated innovation often amounted to repackaging existing services with new names and higher fees. Our current trajectory is not sustainable, Vanessa said. Her presentation now focused on financial projections. If we continue with these practices, I estimate we'll see a 20 to 30% decline in revenue over the next 2 years as client relationships deteriorate and top talent continues to leave for competitors. The room was dead silent. Rebecca Walsh was staring at her notes, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Jennifer Morrison looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. Patterson was gripping his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles had turned white, but Marcus Sterling was furious. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Sterling said, his voice dangerously quiet. You've used company time and resources to conduct what amounts to a comprehensive attack on our business model, our leadership, and our success. You've cherry-picked data to support a narrative that contradicts everything we've achieved. And now you're presenting this hatchet job to the executive committee as if it's legitimate business analysis. These aren't attacks, Mr. Sterling, Vanessa replied calmly. These are observations based on comprehensive data analysis. Every point I've made is supported by documentation that I'm happy to share. My goal isn't to criticize for the sake of criticism, it's to identify problems before they become crises and propose solutions that will strengthen the company. Solutions, Sterling's voice was rising now. You call destroying employee morale and undermining client confidence solutions. I call addressing reality before it forces itself upon us a solution, Vanessa shot back, her own composure beginning to crack. Every successful company goes through periods where they need to honestly evaluate their practices and make corrections. The ones that refuse to do that are the ones that fail. Patterson jumped in, clearly trying to salvage the situation. Vanessa, I think you've misunderstood the purpose of today's meeting. We're here to discuss your division's performance and growth opportunities, not to relitigate company-wide policies that have been successful for decades. But that's exactly the problem, Vanessa said, turning to face Patterson directly. We're so focused on defending past decisions that we're ignoring current realities. Our successful policies are failing. Our employees are leaving. Our clients are unhappy, and our reputation in the industry is declining. I have documentation of all of this, including communications from clients who are actively considering terminating their relationships with us. She clicked to her next slide, which showed email excerpts and meeting notes from various client interactions. The quotes were devastating. Senior executives at major corporations expressing frustration with Sterling's aggressive tactics, questioning the value they were receiving, and in some cases explicitly stating they were exploring alternatives. These clients trusted me enough to share their honest feedback, Vanessa explained. They're telling us exactly what's wrong and giving us the opportunity to fix it. But instead of listening, we're doubling down on the same approaches that created these problems in the first place. Sterling stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. That's enough. This presentation is over. Actually, I'm not finished, Vanessa said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the room. I have specific recommendations for addressing these issues, including implementation timelines and projected outcomes. I said we're done. Sterling's face was red now, his careful corporate facade completely abandoned. What you've presented here isn't analysis, it's sabotage. You've taken isolated incidents and blown them completely out of proportion to create a false narrative of crisis where none exists. The narrative isn't false, Vanessa replied, closing her laptop with deliberate calm. The crisis is real, and ignoring it won't make it go away. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, more final. Vanessa could see the other executives exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation but unwilling to challenge Sterling's authority. Sterling walked slowly around the conference table until he was standing directly across from Vanessa. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with barely controlled rage. In 37 years of building this company, I have never encountered such a blatant display of disloyalty and unprofessionalism. You violated the trust we placed in you, betrayed the confidence of clients who spoke to you in good faith, and attempted to undermine the leadership team that gave you the opportunity to build your career. I've told you the truth, Vanessa replied simply. If that's considered disloyalty, then I'm not sure what kind of organization we're running here. You're not running anything, Sterling snapped, because as of this moment you're terminated. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. Jennifer will handle the paperwork. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Jennifer Morrison looked stricken, clearly not expecting the meeting to escalate to immediate termination. Rebecca Walsh was studying her hands intently, while Patterson wore an expression of barely concealed satisfaction. You're firing me for presenting accurate data and honest analysis? Vanessa asked, her voice incredulous. I'm firing you for gross insubordination, unprofessional conduct, and violation of client confidentiality, Sterling replied coldly. Your severance package will reflect the terms of your employment agreement, minus any applicable penalties for breach of contract. Vanessa gathered her materials slowly, her mind racing but her movements deliberate. She had known this was a possibility, but the reality of it was still shocking. 3 years of exceptional performance, millions in revenue generated, dozens of successful client relationships, all of it swept away in a moment of corporate fury. As she reached the conference room door, Vanessa turned back to face the executives who had just ended her career. You know what the really tragic thing is? She said, her voice calm despite everything that had just happened. Everything I presented today is going to happen anyway. The client defections, the employee exodus, the reputation damage, it's all inevitable now. The only difference is that when it does happen, you won't be able to say nobody warned you. She opened the door and walked out, leaving behind a conference room full of executives who were about to discover that the most expensive mistake in Sterling Financial's history wasn't hiring Vanessa Chen, it was firing her. Within an hour, Vanessa was walking out of Sterling Financial's lobby with her personal belongings in a cardboard box, her access cards deactivated, and her corporate email account already suspended. But she was also walking out with something far more valuable than her former colleagues realized: the complete documentation of everything she had discovered about Sterling Financial's problems, and the knowledge that she had been absolutely unequivocally right about every single point in her presentation. The reckoning was just beginning. Vanessa sat in her Lincoln Park apartment that evening, staring out at Lake Michigan as the sun set behind the Chicago skyline. The cardboard box from Sterling Financial sat unopened on her dining table, a tangible reminder of how quickly a career could end. Her phone had been buzzing constantly since word of her termination began spreading through the financial district's gossip network. Some calls were from headhunters sensing opportunity, others from former colleagues offering sympathy, and a few from clients who had heard rumors and wanted to know what really happened. She ignored most of them. Instead, Vanessa focused on organizing the documentation she had compiled during her analysis of Sterling Financial. Her employment contract included strict non-disclosure agreements, but it also contained whistleblower protections that might prove relevant if the situation escalated. More importantly, she had been careful to base her presentation entirely on information that was either publicly available or had been shared with her in her official capacity as a senior vice president. The first crack in Sterling Financial's carefully constructed facade appeared less than 18 hours after Vanessa's termination. At 11:30 a.m. on Wednesday, Rebecca Walsh received a call that made her blood run cold. Thomas Harrison, the chief financial officer of Meridian Holdings, one of Sterling's largest clients, was requesting an immediate meeting to discuss concerns about our ongoing relationship. Meridian represented nearly $40 million in annual revenue for Sterling Financial, and Harrison's tone suggested this wasn't a routine check-in. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, but by Wednesday afternoon, 2 more major clients had requested similar meetings. Patterson tried to downplay the coincidence, suggesting it was normal quarterly review activity, but Walsh wasn't convinced. She had been in corporate finance long enough to recognize the warning signs of a client exodus. Meanwhile, Sterling Financial's internal problems were multiplying. The company's aggressive growth strategy had created a house of cards that was already beginning to wobble, even before Vanessa's presentation. Several key employees in different divisions had been considering resignation, held back only by year-end bonuses and stock options that vested in December. Vanessa's very public firing, and the rumors about why she had been terminated, gave these employees the final push they needed to make their decisions. By Thursday morning, 3 senior analysts had submitted their resignations. Dr. Michael Torres, who headed the risk assessment team, sent his resignation letter directly to the board of directors, citing fundamental disagreements with current risk management practices. His letter was professionally worded but devastating in its implications, essentially confirming many of the concerns Vanessa had raised in her presentation. Torres had been with Sterling Financial for 7 years and was widely respected both within the company and throughout the industry. His departure couldn't be dismissed as sour grapes or explained away with corporate spin. When senior risk management personnel abandon ship, investors and clients take notice. The situation deteriorated further when news of the resignations reached Sterling Financial's trading floor. The company's stock price, which had been performing well despite broader market volatility, dropped 3% in a single day. Financial journalists began making inquiries about the unusual level of executive turnover, and industry analysts started asking uncomfortable questions about Sterling's internal stability. Marcus Sterling called an emergency meeting of his remaining senior staff, demanding explanations for what he characterized as a coordinated attack on the company. His paranoia was beginning to show, and his typical confidence was replaced by barely controlled desperation. He ordered Jennifer Morrison to conduct exit interviews with every departing employee and to implement new non-disclosure agreements that would prevent former staff from speaking to competitors or journalists. But Sterling's problems were just beginning. On Friday afternoon, Thomas Harrison from Meridian Holdings sat across from Marcus Sterling in the same conference room where Vanessa had delivered her presentation just 4 days earlier. Harrison was a soft-spoken man in his early 50s, known for his methodical approach to business decisions and his loyalty to long-term partnerships. Sterling had always considered him a reliable ally. "Marcus, I'm going to be direct with you because our relationship deserves that level of honesty," Harrison began, his tone respectful but firm. "We've been hearing disturbing reports about Sterling Financial's internal operations and management practices. Normally, I wouldn't give much credence to industry gossip, but when those reports start coming from multiple sources, including some of your own former employees, we have to take them seriously." Sterling felt his stomach drop, but he maintained his composure. "Tom, I hope you're not making business decisions based on rumors and hearsay. Our performance speaks for itself, and our relationship with Meridian has been nothing but successful." "That's exactly what I want to discuss," Harrison replied, opening a folder that contained detailed documentation of Meridian's dealings with Sterling Financial over the past 2 years. "Our relationship has been profitable for you, certainly, but I'm not convinced it's been structured in our best interests." What followed was a meticulous dissection of every major transaction Sterling Financial had handled for Meridian Holdings. Harrison had clearly done his homework, analyzing not just the outcomes of various deals, but the advice Sterling had provided and the alternatives that hadn't been presented. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Sterling consistently recommended the most expensive options, pushed for quick decisions that benefited their fee structure, and failed to present alternatives that might have served Meridian's interests better. The Henderson acquisition is a perfect example, Harrison continued, referencing a deal Sterling had advised on 6 months earlier. You recommended a financing structure that generated almost $2 million in fees for Sterling, but cost us an additional $8 million in unnecessary interest payments over the life of the loan. When I asked Vanessa Chen about alternatives during our preliminary discussions, she mentioned several options that would have been more cost-effective, but none of those appeared in your formal recommendation. Sterling's jaw tightened at the mention of Vanessa's name. I'm not sure what Vanessa may have told you, but I can assure you that our recommendations were based on thorough analysis of your specific situation and market conditions at the time. I'm sure they were, Harrison said diplomatically. But the fact remains that we could have achieved the same results at significantly lower cost if we had been presented with a full range of options. That raises questions about whether our interests are being adequately represented in your recommendations. The meeting continued for another hour, with Harrison systematically reviewing other transactions and identifying patterns of advice that seemed to prioritize Sterling's revenue over Meridian's outcomes. By the time it ended, both men knew that a relationship built over nearly a decade was coming to an end. Marcus, I want to be clear that this isn't personal, Harrison said as they concluded their discussion. Sterling Financial has talented people and impressive capabilities, but we need advisors who put our interests first, even when that means lower fees for themselves. Based on what we've discovered, I'm not confident that's the relationship we have with your firm. 3 days later, Meridian Holdings formally terminated their relationship with Sterling Financial, citing strategic differences in approach to financial advisory services. The termination notice was professionally worded and didn't specify reasons, but in the tight-knit world of corporate finance, word spread quickly about why one of Sterling's largest clients had walked away. The Meridian departure triggered a chain reaction that exceeded even Vanessa's most pessimistic projections. Other clients who had been harboring similar concerns suddenly felt empowered to voice their dissatisfaction. Within 2 weeks, Sterling Financial had lost 4 major accounts representing over $70 million in annual revenue. The financial press began to take notice. The Chicago Business Journal ran a story titled "Sterling Financial Faces Client Exodus Amid Management Turmoil," which detailed the company's recent struggles while carefully avoiding any claims that couldn't be substantiated. The article mentioned Vanessa's termination only briefly, but industry insiders understood the connection between her firing and the subsequent client defections. Marcus Sterling's response to the crisis was characteristically aggressive and ultimately counterproductive. He hired a high-profile public relations firm to manage the company's image, authorized expensive advertising campaigns emphasizing Sterling Financial's stability and success, and began making personal calls to clients to reassure them about the company's direction. These efforts backfired spectacularly. The PR campaign drew additional attention to Sterling's problems, prompting more detailed reporting from financial journalists who began investigating the company's employment practices and client relationships. The advertising spending, which reached nearly $3 million in less than a month, suggested desperation rather than confidence, and Sterling's personal calls to clients often came across as defensive and paranoid, raising more concerns than they resolved. Meanwhile, Vanessa was fielding increasingly interesting phone calls. Word of her presentation and subsequent firing had spread throughout Chicago's financial community, and her reputation as someone willing to speak uncomfortable truths was attracting attention from unexpected quarters. The most intriguing call came from Catherine Hughes, a managing partner at Blackstone Advisory Group, one of Chicago's most prestigious boutique consulting firms. Hughes had built her reputation by taking on challenging turnaround situations and had worked with several major corporations during periods of crisis and transition. "I've been hearing fascinating stories about your recent experience at Sterling Financial," Hughes said during their conversation. "I'm curious whether you'd be interested in discussing some opportunities we're exploring. There are situations where your particular combination of analytical skills and willingness to address difficult realities could be extremely valuable." Vanessa was intrigued but cautious. Her non-compete clause with Sterling Financial would limit her options for several months, and she wasn't interested in burning bridges unnecessarily. But Hughes's reputation was impeccable, and the opportunity to work on high-level turnaround situations was exactly the kind of challenge that appealed to her. "I'd be happy to discuss it," Vanessa replied, "though I should mention that I'm currently bound by certain contractual restrictions that might limit my immediate availability." Actually, that's part of what makes this interesting, Hughes said cryptically. The situation I have in mind might benefit from someone with recent insider knowledge of Sterling Financial's operations and challenges. But let's discuss that in person. Are you available for lunch tomorrow? As Vanessa hung up the phone, she couldn't shake the feeling that events were moving in directions no one could have anticipated. Her brutal honesty had cost her job, but it was also creating opportunities she never could have imagined. The question was whether those opportunities would lead to vindication or simply to new forms of professional warfare. Either way, she was about to find out just how valuable the truth could be in the ruthless world of corporate finance. The avalanche she had triggered at Sterling Financial was gathering momentum, but the most dramatic developments were still to come. The Ritz-Carlton's restaurant on the 34th floor offered spectacular views of downtown Chicago, but Catherine Hughes had specifically chosen a corner table away from the windows. This lunch meeting required privacy, and Hughes had learned long ago that the most sensitive conversations happened in unremarkable settings where eavesdropping was impossible. Vanessa arrived precisely on time, dressed in a navy blazer and carrying a leather portfolio that contained copies of all her non-disclosure agreements. She had spent the morning researching Blackstone Advisory Group and was impressed by what she found. The firm specialized in crisis management and corporate restructuring, with a client list that read like a who's who of Fortune 500 companies that had faced existential challenges. "Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice," Hughes said, as they settled into their seats. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked auburn hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of walking into boardrooms where she was often the only woman present. "I imagine the past week has been quite eventful for you." "That's certainly one way to put it," Vanessa replied with a wry smile. "Though I have to admit, recent events have been remarkably predictable. Sometimes the most surprising thing about the truth is how unsurprising it turns out to be." Hughes laughed, a genuine sound that immediately put Vanessa at ease. "That's exactly the kind of perspective I was hoping to hear. Tell me, what do you know about Sterling Financial's ownership structure?" The question caught Vanessa off guard. Marcus Sterling owns about 40% of the company, with the remaining 60% held by a combination of institutional investors and the employee stock ownership plan. "Why do you ask?" "Because one of those institutional investors is becoming increasingly concerned about their investment," Hughes replied, lowering her voice slightly. "Pemberton Capital Partners owns 18% of Sterling Financial, making them the largest external shareholder. They've been watching recent developments with growing alarm, and they've retained Blackstone Advisory to assess their options." Vanessa felt a chill of understanding. Pemberton Capital was one of the most sophisticated private equity firms in the country, known for their aggressive approach to underperforming investments. If they were concerned enough to hire outside consultants, Sterling Financial's problems were far more serious than even Vanessa had realized. "What kind of assessment are you conducting?" Vanessa asked carefully. "The kind that determines whether Pemberton should push for management changes, demand board representation, or simply cut their losses and sell their stake," Hughes replied bluntly. "Marcus Sterling built an impressive company, but there are growing questions about whether he's still the right person to lead it through current challenges." Over the next hour, Hughes painted a picture of Sterling Financial that was even more dire than what Vanessa had presented in her ill-fated board presentation. Pemberton's internal analysis had identified systemic problems dating back several years, including questionable accounting practices, regulatory compliance issues, and a pattern of strategic decisions that prioritized short-term gains over long-term sustainability. "The client defections you've probably heard about are just the beginning," Hughes explained. "Pemberton's research team has identified at least 6 more major accounts that are actively reviewing their relationships with Sterling. The company's reputation in the industry is deteriorating rapidly, and their employee retention problems are becoming a liability that's affecting their ability to service existing clients." What made the situation particularly volatile was Sterling's debt structure. The company had leveraged heavily to fund their recent expansion, including the acquisition of 2 smaller firms and the opening of new offices in Atlanta and Denver. If revenue continued to decline while debt service remained constant, Sterling Financial could face serious liquidity problems within 18 to 24 months. "Here's where it gets interesting," Hughes continued, leaning forward slightly. "Pemberton has the contractual right to demand an independent board review if the company's performance falls below certain thresholds. Based on recent developments, those thresholds have been met. They're planning to exercise that right within the next 2 weeks." Vanessa absorbed this information carefully. An independent board review typically meant bringing in outside experts to assess management performance and recommend changes. In extreme cases, it could lead to the removal of senior executives, including the CEO. "What does this have to do with me?" Vanessa asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "Pemberton needs someone with intimate knowledge of Sterling Financial's operations to serve as an advisor during the review process," Hughes explained. "Someone who understands both the problems and the potential solutions. Someone who has demonstrated the courage to speak truth to power, even when it costs them personally." The offer was extraordinary. Serving as an advisor to Pemberton during a board review would give Vanessa unprecedented access to Sterling Financial's internal operations and a voice in determining the company's future direction. It would also put her in direct conflict with Marcus Sterling and everyone who had supported her termination. "There are obvious complications," Vanessa said thoughtfully. "My non-compete clause, the non-disclosure agreements, and the fact that I was just fired for essentially the same kind of analysis you're asking me to conduct." "Actually, those complications might work in our favor," Hughes replied. "Your non-compete clause prevents you from working for Sterling's direct competitors, but it doesn't prohibit you from serving as an independent consultant to their shareholders. And your recent termination could be seen as evidence of management's unwillingness to address legitimate concerns, exactly the kind of behavior that justifies board intervention." Hughes reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "This is a preliminary consulting agreement that would retain you as a senior advisor to Blackstone Advisory for the duration of the Sterling Financial Review. The compensation package includes a base fee of $200,000 plus performance bonuses that could reach an additional $300,000 depending on outcomes." Vanessa stared at the folder without opening it. $500,000 was more money than she had made in her best year at Sterling Financial. But the financial compensation wasn't what intrigued her most. This was an opportunity to prove that everything she had said in that disastrous board meeting was not only accurate but actionable. "What would my role involve specifically?" she asked. "Due diligence, strategic analysis, and recommendations for operational improvements," Hughes replied. "Essentially, you'd be conducting the same kind of comprehensive review you presented to Sterling's management, but this time for an audience that actually wants to hear the truth." The irony was almost overwhelming. A week ago, Vanessa had been fired for presenting uncomfortable facts about Sterling Financial's problems. Now she was being offered a lucrative consulting position to present those same facts to people with the power to actually address them. But before she could respond, Hughes's phone buzzed with an urgent message. As she read it, her expression grew serious. "We may need to accelerate our timeline," Hughes said, setting down her phone. That was from Pemberton's legal team. "They've just learned that Sterling Financial is planning to announce a major debt restructuring next week, which could significantly complicate any board intervention. If we're going to act, it needs to be soon." The restaurant around them continued its quiet lunch service, but Vanessa felt as though she had stepped into the eye of a corporate hurricane. Forces were moving that would reshape Sterling Financial's future, and she was being offered a chance to help direct those forces. "I need to understand something," Vanessa said carefully. "What's Pemberton's ultimate goal here? Are they trying to fix Sterling Financial, or are they positioning themselves to profit from its collapse?" Hughes appreciated the directness of the question. Pemberton's primary obligation is to their investors, which means maximizing the value of their Sterling Financial stake. If that can be accomplished by fixing the company's problems and returning it to sustainable profitability, that's their preferred outcome. But if management changes are necessary to achieve that goal, they won't hesitate to make them. Including replacing Marcus Sterling as CEO? If the board review determines that new leadership is necessary, yes. Pemberton has the voting power to force management changes, and they're prepared to use it if current leadership can't demonstrate a credible plan for addressing the company's challenges. Vanessa thought about Marcus Sterling's reaction to her presentation. His absolute refusal to consider that Sterling Financial might have serious problems that required fundamental changes in approach. She remembered his fury when confronted with data that contradicted his preferred narrative, and his immediate decision to eliminate the messenger rather than address the message. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" she asked. "The board review would begin within 2 weeks and conclude within 30 days, Hughes replied. "If management changes are recommended, they could be implemented immediately following the review's completion. In theory, Sterling Financial could have new leadership within 6 weeks." The speed was breathtaking. Vanessa had assumed that corporate change happened slowly, with months of deliberation and gradual transitions. But when major shareholders decided to act decisively, apparently they could reshape entire companies in a matter of weeks. "I have one more question," Vanessa said, her voice quiet but determined. "If this process results in management changes at Sterling Financial, would there be opportunities for people like me to return to the company in leadership roles?" Hughes smiled for the first time since their conversation had turned serious. That's exactly the kind of thinking Pemberton is looking for. They don't just want to identify problems, they want to implement solutions. And sometimes the best solutions involve bringing in people who have demonstrated both competence and integrity, even if their previous employers were too short-sighted to appreciate those qualities. Vanessa reached for the consulting agreement and opened it to the first page. The language was complex, but the essential terms were clear. She would serve as a senior advisor to Blackstone Advisory during their assessment of Sterling Financial, with compensation that reflected the high stakes and sensitive nature of the work. But more than the money, what attracted Vanessa was the opportunity for vindication. Everything she had said in that disastrous board meeting was about to be subjected to the most rigorous possible review by people with the expertise and authority to evaluate her claims objectively. "When would you need my decision?" she asked. "Pemberton is announcing the board review next Monday," Hughes replied. "We'd need to have our advisory team in place by then, which means we'd need your signed agreement by Friday afternoon. 3 days to make a decision that could reshape her entire career. 3 days to decide whether to rejoin the battle for Sterling Financial's future, this time fighting from a position of strength rather than vulnerability." As Vanessa looked out at the Chicago skyline, she could see Sterling Financial's building in the distance, its glass facade reflecting the afternoon sun. Somewhere in that building, Marcus Sterling was probably conducting meetings, making decisions, and continuing to operate as though the crisis engulfing his company was just a temporary setback that could be overcome with better public relations and more aggressive sales tactics. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. And Vanessa Chen was about to get the chance to prove that sometimes the most expensive truth is also the most valuable one. Friday afternoon, Vanessa signed the consulting agreement with Blackstone Advisory Group in Catherine Hughes's downtown office. The irony wasn't lost on her. Exactly 1 week after being escorted out of Sterling Financial with her belongings in a cardboard box, she was now being paid handsomely to expose the very problems that had cost her job. The weekend was a blur of preparation. Hughes's team provided Vanessa with access to Pemberton Capital's internal research on Sterling Financial, and what she discovered was even more damaging than her own analysis had suggested. Pemberton's investigators had uncovered financial irregularities that bordered on fraud, employment practices that violated federal regulations, and a pattern of client misrepresentation that could trigger regulatory intervention. Most shocking was the discovery that Sterling Financial's impressive growth numbers were partly fabricated. The company had been using aggressive revenue recognition practices to inflate quarterly results, booking fees from incomplete transactions and counting projected earnings as actual revenue. These practices weren't technically illegal, but they painted a picture of a company desperate to maintain appearances regardless of underlying reality. Monday morning brought the earthquake Pemberton had promised. At 9 a.m. Eastern Time, Sterling Financial's board of directors received formal notice that Pemberton Capital Partners was exercising their contractual right to demand an independent management review. The notice cited material concerns about corporate governance, financial management, and strategic direction, and demanded immediate access to all company records and personnel. Marcus Sterling's response was swift and predictably combative. Within hours, he had retained Morrison & Associates, one of Chicago's most aggressive corporate defense firms, and issued a statement characterizing Pemberton's action as a hostile takeover attempt disguised as corporate governance. He accused Pemberton of trying to destabilize the company for their own financial gain and vowed to fight any attempts to interfere with Sterling Financial's operations. But Sterling's defiance couldn't stop the legal machinery that Pemberton had set in motion. Corporate bylaws that Sterling himself had approved years earlier gave major shareholders the right to demand independent reviews under specific circumstances. Those circumstances had clearly been met, and Sterling's protests only made him appear desperate and out of touch. The review team assembled by Blackstone Advisory was formidable. In addition to Vanessa, Hughes had recruited Dr. Amanda Foster, a former federal banking regulator with expertise in corporate compliance, James Rodriguez, a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering financial irregularities, and Patricia Wells, an organizational psychologist who analyzed corporate culture and management effectiveness. Their first meeting took place Tuesday morning in a conference room at Blackstone's offices. The atmosphere was businesslike but charged with anticipation. Everyone understood they were embarking on an investigation that could destroy careers and reshape an entire company. "Our mandate is straightforward," Hughes began, addressing the assembled team. "Pemberton wants to know whether Sterling Financial's current management is capable of addressing the company's challenges and returning it to sustainable profitability. If the answer is no, they want specific recommendations for alternative approaches, including potential management changes." Dr. Foster spoke first, outlining the regulatory concerns that had emerged from Pemberton's initial research. Sterling Financial was operating dangerously close to several federal compliance thresholds, particularly regarding client disclosure requirements and risk management protocols. Recent employee departures had left critical compliance functions understaffed, creating potential liability that could trigger federal intervention. "The Department of Labor has already opened a preliminary inquiry into Sterling's employment practices," Foster explained. 3 former employees have filed complaints alleging workplace harassment and retaliation for reporting ethical concerns. If those complaints are substantiated, the company could face significant fines and mandatory oversight. Rodriguez's forensic analysis was even more damning. He had identified numerous transactions where Sterling Financial's fee structures appeared designed to maximize their revenue rather than serve client interests. In several cases, the company had recommended complex financial instruments that generated substantial fees but provided questionable value to clients. "The Hartwell Industries restructuring is particularly problematic," Rodriguez noted, referencing a deal Sterling had completed 6 months earlier. The client paid almost $3 million in fees for a debt restructuring that could have been accomplished for less than half that amount using simpler instruments. When Hartwell's CFO questioned the complexity, Sterling's team insisted it was necessary due to unique market conditions, but our analysis shows those conditions didn't actually exist. Wells's psychological assessment of Sterling Financial's corporate culture was perhaps the most devastating. Through interviews with former employees and analysis of internal communications, she had documented a pattern of management behavior that prioritized loyalty over competence, discouraged dissent, and punished anyone who raised concerns about company practices. "This is a classic case of organizational dysfunction driven by authoritarian leadership," Wells explained. "Marcus Sterling has created an environment where questioning his decisions is career suicide, which means he receives no meaningful feedback about the consequences of his choices. The result is a company that's increasingly disconnected from reality and unable to adapt to changing circumstances." Vanessa listened to these presentations with a mixture of vindication and horror. Everything her colleagues were describing aligned perfectly with her own observations, but the scope of Sterling Financial's problems was far worse than she had realized. She hadn't just been fired for telling the truth, she had been fired for telling a truth that was barely scratching the surface of much deeper problems. "What's our access to current Sterling Financial operations?" Vanessa asked. "Legally, they have to provide us with any documents or information we request," Hughes replied. "Practically, they're going to make that as difficult as possible. Sterling's legal team is already arguing that our requests are overly broad and potentially harmful to ongoing business operations." The cat-and-mouse game that followed was intense and revealing. Every document request was met with delays, objections, and demands for clarification. When the review team requested access to client files, Sterling's lawyers argued that confidentiality agreements prevented disclosure. When they asked for employee records, HR claimed that privacy regulations limited what could be shared. But Sterling Financial's resistance tactics backfired spectacularly. Their obvious attempts to obstruct the investigation only reinforced concerns about what they were trying to hide. More importantly, former employees who had been reluctant to speak publicly began reaching out to the review team voluntarily, offering information and documentation that Sterling couldn't block. The breakthrough came on Thursday when Dr. Michael Torres, the risk management executive who had resigned the week before, contacted Vanessa directly. Torres had kept copies of internal memos and risk assessments that documented serious problems Sterling's management had chosen to ignore. "I stayed quiet when I resigned because I didn't want to burn bridges," Torres explained during a confidential meeting at a downtown coffee shop. "But after seeing how they're trying to obstruct this review, I realized they're never going to change voluntarily. The problems I identified in my risk assessments are real, and if they're not addressed soon, they could destroy the company." Torres provided the review team with internal documents showing that Sterling Financial's risk management protocols had been systematically bypassed over the past 18 months. Deals that should have been rejected based on risk criteria were approved after intervention from senior management. Client credit assessments were modified to justify transactions that generated higher fees. Warning signs about potential compliance violations were documented but never acted upon. Most damaging was a series of emails between Marcus Sterling and William Patterson discussing strategies for managing regulatory inquiries and client complaints. The emails didn't explicitly authorize illegal activity, but they revealed a pattern of thinking that prioritized avoiding consequences over addressing underlying problems. "They're not trying to fix anything," Torres told Vanessa. "They're just trying to keep problems hidden until they become someone else's responsibility. That's not risk management, that's corporate negligence." By Friday afternoon, the review team had assembled a comprehensive picture of Sterling Financial's dysfunction. The company was facing a perfect storm of client defections, employee departures, regulatory scrutiny, and financial pressures that would require dramatic changes to survive. Current management had not only failed to address these challenges, they had actively made them worse through denial, obstruction, and increasingly desperate attempts to maintain unsustainable practices. Hughes called an emergency meeting with Pemberton Capital's leadership team for Saturday morning. The preliminary findings were so serious that waiting for the formal review completion could put Pemberton's investment at risk. "We're not dealing with ordinary business challenges," Hughes explained to Pemberton's executives via video conference. "This is a company in crisis being led by people who refuse to acknowledge reality. Every day that current management remains in place increases the likelihood of catastrophic outcomes." Richard Pemberton himself, the firm's founding partner, participated in the call from his weekend retreat in the Hamptons. At 62, he had built his reputation on identifying opportunities others missed and acting decisively when circumstances demanded it. "What are you recommending?" Pemberton asked bluntly. "Immediate management changes," Hughes replied without hesitation. "Marcus Sterling and his senior team have lost the confidence of clients, employees, and regulators. They're not capable of implementing the changes necessary to save the company. And if they refuse to step aside voluntarily, then we force them out. Your ownership stake gives you the votes to remove the current board and install new leadership. It's not a decision to take lightly, but based on what we've discovered, it may be the only way to protect your investment." Pemberton was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. Forcing out a founding CEO was never simple, even when justified by performance issues. There would be legal challenges, public relations battles, and potential disruption to ongoing business operations. "How quickly could new management be put in place?" he asked. "If the board acts decisively, new leadership could be installed within 2 weeks," Hughes replied. "We've already identified several candidates who have the experience and credibility to stabilize the situation quickly. What about interim leadership during the transition?" Hughes glanced at Vanessa, who had been listening quietly to the conversation. "We have someone in mind who knows the company intimately, has the trust of key employees and clients, and has already demonstrated the courage to address difficult problems honestly." The implication was clear, though no one spoke Vanessa's name aloud. The woman who had been fired for telling the truth about Sterling Financial's problems was being positioned to return as the person responsible for fixing them. The revolution that would transform Sterling Financial and vindicate Vanessa's brutal honesty was about to begin. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that made Chicago's skyline look especially sharp against the lake. At exactly 8 a.m., 3 black SUVs pulled up to Sterling Financial's headquarters. From the first vehicle emerged Richard Pemberton himself, flanked by his legal team. From the second came Catherine Hughes and the board review committee. From the third stepped Vanessa Chen, carrying a briefcase that contained the documentation that would end Marcus Sterling's reign. The security guards in Sterling Financial's lobby had no idea they were witnessing a corporate coup. To them, it looked like any other high-level business meeting. They dutifully checked IDs, issued visitor badges, and directed the group to the executive elevator bank. None of them realized that by the end of the day, their company would have entirely new leadership. Marcus Sterling was in his office reviewing quarterly projections when his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Sterling, there's a group here from Pemberton Capital requesting an immediate meeting with the board of directors. They say it's regarding the management review." Sterling's jaw tightened. He had been expecting this confrontation, but he thought he had more time to prepare his defenses. His legal team had assured him that Pemberton's review process would take weeks to complete, giving him opportunities to challenge their findings and rally support from other shareholders. "Tell them I'll be available this afternoon," Sterling replied curtly. "I have client meetings scheduled all morning." 5 minutes later, his assistant returned, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, they're insisting that all board members be present within the next hour. They've sent formal notices citing emergency governance provisions in the corporate charter." Sterling felt his stomach drop. Emergency governance provisions could only be invoked under specific circumstances that suggested Pemberton had found evidence of serious misconduct or negligence. If they were moving this aggressively, their findings must be devastating. The emergency board meeting convened at 10 a.m. in Sterling Financial's largest conference room. All 7 board members were present, along with their legal counsel. Pemberton's team occupied one side of the massive table, while Sterling and his allies sat across from them like defendants facing judgment. Richard Pemberton wasted no time on pleasantries. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for accommodating this emergency session. Over the past week, our independent review of Sterling Financial's operations has uncovered evidence of systematic mismanagement that poses immediate threats to the company's viability and to shareholders' investments." What followed was a methodical destruction of everything Marcus Sterling had built over 37 years. Catherine Hughes presented the review team's findings with clinical precision, documenting financial irregularities, regulatory violations, and management failures that painted a picture of a company in freefall. The forensic accounting evidence was particularly damaging. James Rodriguez had traced a pattern of fee inflation and client overcharging that stretched back nearly 3 years. In case after case, Sterling Financial had recommended expensive solutions to problems that could have been solved more efficiently, generating millions in unnecessary fees while providing questionable value to clients. The Meridian Holdings restructuring that we discussed earlier is emblematic of broader practices, Rodriguez explained, projecting financial charts onto the room's display screens. "Our analysis shows that at least 40% of the fees charged were for services that provided no measurable benefit to the client. This pattern exists across multiple accounts and represents a systematic prioritization of Sterling Financial's revenue over client outcomes." Dr. Foster's regulatory analysis was equally devastating. She had identified 17 instances where Sterling Financial had operated outside federal compliance guidelines, including failures to properly disclose risks to clients, inadequate due diligence on investment recommendations, and employment practices that violated federal workplace protection laws. "The Department of Labor has escalated their inquiry to a formal investigation," Foster reported. "Based on our analysis, Sterling Financial faces potential fines of up to $8 million, plus mandatory oversight that would severely restrict the company's operational flexibility." But it was Patricia Wells's cultural assessment that delivered the killing blow to Sterling's leadership. Her interviews with former employees had revealed a pattern of retaliation against anyone who raised ethical concerns, systematic suppression of dissenting opinions, and a corporate culture that valued loyalty over competence. "This is not a case of isolated management mistakes," Wells concluded. "This represents a fundamental failure of leadership that has created systemic dysfunction throughout the organization. The problems we've identified cannot be solved with incremental changes. They require comprehensive transformation of both leadership and corporate culture." Throughout these presentations, Marcus Sterling sat in stunned silence. Every concern that Vanessa had raised in her presentation 10 days earlier was being validated by independent experts with impeccable credentials. The analysis he had dismissed as sabotage was now being presented to his own board of directors as evidence of his failure as a leader. When the presentations concluded, Pemberton addressed the board directly. "Based on these findings, Pemberton Capital Partners has lost confidence in current management's ability to address Sterling Financial's challenges. We are formally requesting the immediate resignation of Marcus Sterling as Chief Executive Officer, along with the resignations of COO William Patterson and CFO Rebecca Walsh." The demand hung in the air like a physical presence. Sterling finally found his voice, rising from his chair with the kind of righteous anger that had served him well in past confrontations. "This is outrageous," he declared, his voice echoing off the conference room's walls. "You've conducted a witch hunt designed to justify a predetermined conclusion. Every allegation you've made takes normal business practices out of context and presents them in the worst possible light." "Mr. Sterling," Pemberton replied calmly, "nothing we've presented is taken out of context. These are documented patterns of behavior that have damaged client relationships, violated regulatory requirements, and created legal liabilities that threaten the company's existence. You're trying to steal a company that I built from nothing, Sterling shot back. This isn't about governance, it's about greed. You want to force me out so you can install puppet management that will maximize your short-term returns at the expense of long-term growth. Richard Pemberton had anticipated this response. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder containing signed statements from former Sterling Financial employees, copies of client communications expressing dissatisfaction with the company's services, and regulatory correspondence documenting ongoing investigations. Mr. Sterling, I understand this is difficult to accept, but the evidence is overwhelming. Your leadership has created problems that are getting worse every day. 3 more major clients terminated their relationships with Sterling Financial last week. The company's reputation in the industry is declining rapidly. If these trends continue, there won't be a company left to argue about. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Several of them had been Sterling's allies for years, but the evidence presented by Pemberton's team was impossible to dismiss. More importantly, their fiduciary duty required them to act in the best interests of shareholders, even if that meant removing the company's founder. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, Sterling Financial's longest-serving independent board member, spoke for the first time during the meeting. Marcus, I've supported your leadership through many challenges over the years, but this situation is different. The problems documented by this review are serious and immediate. We have a responsibility to shareholders and employees to address them decisively. One by one, the other board members voiced similar concerns. Even Sterling's closest allies acknowledged that the company faced existential challenges that required dramatic action. By the time the discussion concluded, Sterling had lost the support of every board member except himself. The formal vote was anticlimactic. By a margin of 6-1, Sterling Financial's board of directors accepted Marcus Sterling's resignation as chief executive officer, effective immediately. William Patterson and Rebecca Walsh were also removed from their positions, leaving the company's senior leadership structure completely dismantled. As Sterling gathered his belongings and prepared to leave the conference room for the final time, Pemberton made one final announcement that completed the corporate revolution. The board has asked me to announce that Vanessa Chen has agreed to serve as Sterling Financial's interim chief executive officer, effective immediately. Ms. Chen will lead the company through this transition period and implement the operational changes necessary to restore Sterling Financial's reputation and financial stability. For a moment, Marcus Sterling was speechless. The woman he had fired for disloyalty and unprofessional conduct was now sitting at the head of the table where he had ruled for nearly 4 decades. The presentation he had dismissed as sabotage had become the blueprint for his own downfall. "You planned this from the beginning," Sterling said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The presentation, the review, everything. This was always about putting her in charge." Vanessa spoke for the first time since entering the conference room. "Mr. Sterling, I never wanted this outcome. I wanted you to listen to the concerns I raised and work together to address them. You made different choices, and this is where those choices led." Sterling stared at her for a long moment, perhaps finally understanding that his refusal to face reality had made this confrontation inevitable. Then he walked out of Sterling Financial's headquarters for the last time, leaving behind the company he had built and the legacy he had destroyed through his own stubborn pride. 7 days after being fired for telling the truth, Vanessa Chen was the new CEO of Sterling Financial Group. The most expensive honesty in corporate history had finally paid off. Within an hour of Marcus Sterling's departure, Vanessa Chen was sitting in the CEO's office that had been his domain for 37 years. The mahogany desk was imposing, the view spectacular, but what struck her most was how quiet everything had become. The constant buzz of activity that had characterized Sterling's leadership style had given way to an almost eerie calm. Her first call came from Thomas Harrison at Meridian Holdings. Word of the management change had spread through Chicago's financial district faster than a commodity price alert, and clients who had fled Sterling Financial were suddenly very interested in having conversations. "Vanessa, I have to admit I'm surprised by today's developments," Harrison said, his tone cautious but intrigued. "When we terminated our relationship last week, I assumed Sterling Financial was heading for a prolonged decline. This changes things considerably." "I understand your skepticism, Tom," Vanessa replied, looking out at the city skyline from her new vantage point. "The problems that led to your decision haven't magically disappeared, but now we have the authority to actually address them instead of just documenting them." Within 24 hours, Vanessa had implemented her first major changes. She abolished the fee maximization policies that had driven so many client complaints, replacing them with transparent pricing structures that prioritized long-term relationships over short-term revenue. She restructured the risk management department, giving them direct reporting authority to the CEO's office instead of burying them within operations where their warnings could be ignored. Most importantly, she began the process of rebuilding Sterling Financial's culture. The climate of fear and retaliation that had characterized Marcus Sterling's leadership was replaced with open forums, where employees could raise concerns without fear of retribution. Vanessa instituted weekly town halls where any employee could ask questions directly to senior management. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dr. Michael Torres, whose resignation had helped trigger the management review, withdrew his resignation and agreed to return as Chief Risk Officer. 3 other senior analysts who had left for competitors requested meetings about returning to Sterling Financial. The company's internal job posting system, which had been virtually dormant for months, suddenly came alive with applications from talented professionals who had previously avoided Sterling because of its reputation. But Vanessa's most challenging task was rebuilding relationships with clients who had lost faith in the company. This required more than policy changes. It required personal accountability for past mistakes and concrete demonstrations that Sterling Financial had fundamentally changed its approach. The breakthrough came during a meeting with Janet Morrison, CEO of Apex Manufacturing, one of Sterling's former clients who had terminated their relationship 6 months earlier after a dispute over investment advice that had cost them nearly $2 million. "I'm willing to listen," Morrison said during their lunch meeting at the Union League Club, "but I need to understand why this time will be different." Marcus Sterling was very convincing when he promised changes after our problems last year. "What guarantee do I have that you won't just revert to old practices once the crisis passes?" Vanessa had prepared for this question carefully. Instead of making promises, she presented Morrison with a detailed accountability framework that Sterling Financial had implemented. Every client relationship would be subject to quarterly independent reviews. Fee structures would be transparent and benchmarked against industry standards. Most importantly, client satisfaction scores would be directly tied to executive compensation, ensuring that management's financial interests aligned with client outcomes. "I'm not asking you to trust my words," Vanessa explained. "I'm asking you to evaluate our actions over time. If we fail to meet these commitments, you'll have clear metrics to measure that failure and concrete recourse to address it." Morrison was impressed by the specificity of the proposal, but she had one final test. "I want to review the Hartwell Industries restructuring that Sterling handled for us last year. Your forensic team identified significant problems with that transaction. How do you plan to address the financial impact of those mistakes?" This was the moment Vanessa had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The Hartwell restructuring had been one of the deals that James Rodriguez had identified as particularly problematic during the board review. Sterling Financial had charged Apex Manufacturing nearly $3 million for a transaction that could have been completed for half that amount. "We're going to refund the excess fees," Vanessa said simply. "Our analysis shows that you were overcharged by approximately $1.4 million. Sterling Financial will credit your account for that amount, plus interest within 30 days. Morrison nearly choked on her coffee. In 3 decades of corporate relationships, she had never seen a financial services firm voluntarily refund fees, especially not fees that had been paid months earlier without formal dispute. "You're serious about this," Morrison said, studying Vanessa's face for any sign of deception. "Completely serious. We can't change what happened under previous management, but we can take responsibility for it and make it right. That's not just good business, it's the right thing to do." Word of Sterling Financial's refund policy spread through the corporate community like wildfire. Within 2 weeks, 4 former clients had scheduled meetings to discuss resuming their relationships with the company. The gesture had cost Sterling nearly $6 million in refunded fees, but it generated far more value in restored credibility and renewed business opportunities. 3 months after taking over as CEO, Vanessa received a call that validated everything she had endured to reach this point. Richard Pemberton was on the line with quarterly results that exceeded everyone's most optimistic projections. "Client retention is up to 97%, Pemberton reported. New business development has increased by 40% over the previous quarter. Employee satisfaction scores have reached the highest levels in company history. Most importantly, our regulatory compliance issues have been completely resolved, and the Department of Labor has closed their investigation with no penalties." But the most satisfying validation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Kim, Vanessa's former colleague who had warned her about companies that prioritized appearance over substance, sent a handwritten note that arrived with the morning mail. "I've been following Sterling Financial's transformation in the business press," Sarah wrote. "What you've accomplished in 3 months is remarkable, but what impresses me most is that you've proven something I've always believed. The truth doesn't just set you free, it makes you powerful. Your willingness to speak honestly when it was dangerous has given you the credibility to lead when it matters most." As Vanessa read those words in her office overlooking Lake Michigan, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 10 days ago, she had been a disgraced former executive, fired for the crime of telling uncomfortable truths to people who didn't want to hear them. Today, she was the CEO of a transformed company, leading an organization that had become a model for how corporate honesty could create sustainable value. The most expensive truth in Sterling Financial's history had indeed proven to be the most valuable. Sometimes the cost of honesty is your job. Sometimes the reward is getting to build something better than what existed before. 7 days. That's all it had taken for the truth to travel from career suicide to corporate salvation, and for Vanessa Chen, it was worth every moment of the journey. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.